Our next speaker is Bonner Miller Cutting. She is the author of Necessary Mischief, a fascinating collection of essays on the authorship question. She's based in Houston. She will help us understand Looney's method in approaching this discovery. Bonner.
Thank you. I'm going to take a retrospective look at what Looney wrote and some of his thought processes as he developed this phenomenal book. There are now 3 editions that are, and a few others here and there on the internet that are largely available to just look at Looney's book. His own in 1920 that we're here today to celebrate, the 3rd edition in 1975, and now Jim's wonderful new edition, which I'm going to be talking about in a few minutes, which has some wonderful things in it. I'm going to talk about 2 things. First of all is how Looney searched for Shakespeare, and then secondly, how additional information that we have learned since Looney actually published Shakespeare Identified, how that has been supportive of his original discovery. Now, it would seem that there was nothing particularly remarkable about John Thomas Looney. And by the way, I'm calling it Looney because that's how I heard my mom call it all those years, and it's kind of hard to change my mindset on that. By vocation, he was the headmaster for boarding school in Gateshead on Tyne. His name, however, would not be remembered today were it not for the fact that he discovered, by way of an exhaustive methodological search, the answer to this question: who wrote the works of William Shakespeare? This discovery made by this unassuming man is the most important event in literary history. Now, he took a look at the Stratford man's life from the Stratfordian perspective, and he realized that it could be divided, the man's career could be divided into 3 periods. First, there was an early period where Mr. Shakespeare, prior to his venturing to London, he grew up in Stratford, and where he would eventually go to London and become an actor, supposedly, and a dramatist and a poet in the conventional view. There was a middle period where he produced remarkable literature in London, and then there was a closing period back in Stratford. Now, Looney has this to say: the contrast between the coarse and illiterate circumstances of his early life and the highly cultured character of the work he is supposed to have produced is not, however, the strongest aspect of this particular argument. Although quite alone, it is enough to have created serious misgivings. What he focuses on, and this is just so brilliant, the closing chapter of the Stratford man's life is a situation which altogether stands outside the general human experience. Now, what he means is, if the orthodox narrative were true, we have the greatest work of self-development and self-realization, as Maslow would say, self-actualization, as we know now is what we call this, that genius has ever enabled any man to perform. If after having performed so miraculous a work, this same genius retired to Stratford to devote himself to houses, lands, money, and malt, leaving no traces of intellectual or literary interest, he achieved the greatest work of self-stultification in the annals of mankind, from what he calls self-realization, and we'd now say self-actualization to self-stultification. Looney writes, "It is difficult to believe that with such a beginning he, Mr. Shakespeare, could have attained such heights as he is supposed to have done. It is more difficult to believe that with such glorious achievement in his middle period, he could have fallen to the level of his closing period, and it is impossible to believe that the same man could have accomplished 2 such stupendous and mutually nullifying feats." Isn't this just incredible? It's so well thought out and so well phrased. Looney did more than just set out the difficulties of the conventional Shakespeare story. He defined the character of the problem. Here, then, were the greatest literary treasures in England, ranked by universal consent amongst the highest literary achievements of mankind. To all intents and purposes, they are of unknown origin. And he defined why it matters. The discovery of the author and the establishing of his just claims to honor is therefore a duty. And this is so important to English people because they take duty, and we do too, very seriously. It is a duty which mankind owes to one of the most illustrious of men, a duty from which Englishmen can never be absolved if by any means the task can be accomplished. So there we have it. He was going to set out to accomplish this task. He had objected to what had heretofore been what he called the pick and try method of searching for an author. And it had been done before, and it was going to be basically what's been done ever since. A historian, somebody finds an interesting person historically, picks them out, gets a few facts of their life, and around these facts constructs a scenario as how this person came to be Shakespeare. And that's basically what we've been used to ever since. However, Looney wasn't going to go about it that way. He developed, as everybody in this room knows, a Shakespearean profile. Now, profiles are commonplace these days. We're really quite used to profiles. There are television series about profilers and profiles, and law enforcement, if they're looking for a missing person or a criminal, they look at the circumstances of the person's life, the circumstances of the crime scene, whatever, and they construct a profile around it. However, using a profile to search for Shakespeare had never been done before, and it would never be done again. Isn't that just remarkable? His 18-characteristic profile consisted of 9 general features and 9 special characteristics. I mean, they're really very interesting. A lot of the book goes into why he picked these 18 features and his thought processes behind that. What I'm going to talk about is how difficult it was going to be at the outset to find a person, a single historical person, 300 years later, now it's 400 years later, but all these centuries later, who would fulfill all of these 18 characteristics. And this is what I mean by that. Some of these characteristics are a bit inconsistent, a little bit internally discordant. Think about it. Find one person who fits all these. One of the things I want to point out is initially, the very first characteristic is that Shakespeare's a recognized genius. Okay, so why is he not adequately appreciated? If you're a recognized genius, isn't that appreciation enough? Another one of his profile characteristics is this person is eccentric and mysterious, and according to Looney, a man apart. Okay, so we've got to find that. Then we need to find somebody who has known literary taste, interest in drama, is an established lyric poet, and has a superior education. Now, isn't that somebody that comes in contact with a lot of the people, the educated and intelligent people of the literary circles of England, the intelligentsia, the cognoscenti, whatever? They know this person, right? And it would also, if someone with superior education should really stand out in a society when 80% of the men were stone cold illiterate and 95% of women were illiterate. High illiteracy rate. But yet, I mean, this person should have been acquainted with a lot of people, or I might say a lot of people should have been acquainted with him, whoever this person is that Looney is searching for. Now, there were only, another thing is, if we look at the other side, the special characteristics, Looney feels that this person, Shakespeare, is a member of the high aristocracy. Now, that's going to narrow the subset, tremendously, because there were only about 55 families in the high aristocracy in England. And this number, according to Lawrence Stone, Crisis of Aristocracy, stayed pretty much consistent through the whole Tudor century. So now we're looking at about 55 families and family members or whatever. Now, characteristics 1 through 7 are pretty much consistent with an aristocratic author. And by the way, that it was someone from the high aristocracy would not have been unusual on Mr. Looney's part, because Walt Whitman had already pointed that out, that you've got yourself some wolfish earl who did it, but whatever. He's puts this down. And someone in the high aristocracy would have feudal connections, would be a Lancastrian supporter if they're around and about in the reign of Elizabeth, doing very well for themselves. They'd be an enthusiast for Italy, a follower of sports, particularly aristocratic sports, falconry, hawking, tennis, a lover of music, and improvident with money. This is something that was pretty typical of the aristocracy, because they regarded being a money manager something beneath their dignity. But of course, this is totally Mr. Stratford from Mr. Shakespeare from Stratford is very provident with money. In fact, he does very well for himself. So he really doesn't fit any of these. Conflicting attitude to women. Now, that's more of a universal characteristic, not necessarily of any particular social group. And now we get Yeah, all right. To probably Catholic leaning. Now, this really is pretty much inconsistent with an aristocratic author because it's discordant with the fact that most of the higher aristocracy converted to the Protestant religion when Henry VIII broke with the Church of Rome over his divorce with Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, and we know about that stuff. It became even more reinforced in the reign of Edward VI. Now, there was a little bit of reinvigoration of the Catholic Church with Mary Tudor. For those 5 years she was queen. But once Elizabeth ascended to the throne in 1588, if you look around, most of her courtiers and the people close to her, the people working in her royal administration, were very strongly in the Protestant side of things. And many, including William Cecil Lord Burleigh, was educated at St. John's College, Cambridge, which was pretty much an epicenter of the Protestant Reformation. So you have these two things, high aristocracy, probably Catholic leanings, and now we've really closed down that subset of people that we're looking at to find a match for this thing. Now, Looney also notices that he was going to have some obstacles to overcome when he was searching. For one thing, he was looking for someone who probably did not want to be found at the time. The person himself did not want to be found out. Or at that same time or later time, other people did not want him to be found out. They wanted him to stay concealed, either by motivated by a desire to suppress what he was doing, or on the other hand, to protect him because they liked him. So there are a lot of different motives and motivations that could have been at play here in this suppression of the identity of the author. Nevertheless, he was going to start his search, and he needed a crucial test to start out the search with. He hypothesized that the best place to start would be at the interface between the writer, whoever it was, between his early works, which he was sure there would be, we'll talk about that in just a minute, and the beginning of his Shakespeare works, which led him to Venus and Adonis for a point of departure. Now, here's the fact pattern. Of course, Shakespeare, whoever he was an accomplished lyric poet. Of that, Mr. Looney was certain. And I don't really think that that's in doubt. In fact, the narrative poem Venus and Adonis was the first work to be published under the name William Shakespeare in 1593. Now we get to the crucial hypothesis. Looney thought that Venus and Adonis was too lengthy and finished a work to be what we would look at as a starter poem, to be this person's first rodeo, as we would say. It had its 6-line stanza form and iambic pentameter and ABABCC rhymes. He thought that this showed a practiced hand. And this is in stark opposition to the Stratfordians, who actually believe that this was, as I just said, his first rodeo. That he had gone to London, there, a jolly young man from Stratford, and he'd been writing a few plays, and then the theaters were closed due to the plague, and so their genius decided that he would try his hand at poetry, and he wrote Venus and Adonis. And the rest of us just don't understand what genius can do. But Looney, of course, did not buy off on that. Looney's conclusion was there had to have been earlier, shorter poems in the stanza form of Venus and Adonis. There just had to be. But the problem was, is they might not have survived through the centuries, may not have ever been published, may be hanging out in manuscripts somewhere, and those might have gone to the four winds and be no longer extant. And if this were the case, his search would likely be futile. But he decided to press on anyway. In fact, he makes this comment, which is so cute, and I was amused by this. He writes, "This may appear a crude and mechanical way of setting about an inquiry of this kind. It was, at any rate, a simple instrument and needed little skill in handling." Isn't that just refreshingly intellectually honest? He was going to go about looking for stanza forms, six lines, iambic pentameter, ABABCC, and see what he came up with. Well, he had looked through anthologies and hadn't really found anything that resonated with him. He'd found a few poems in this stanza form, but finally he came upon this poem called Women, sometimes it's called Women's Changeableness, and it was by Edward de Vere. if women could be fair and yet not fond. Wow, this is iambic pentameter. A, B, A, B, C, C. Best of all, it had a sense of harmony with Shakespeare's work. This is what made this poem resonate. It had appeared also in Palgrave's Golden Treasury anthology. But it's by somebody named Edward de Vere, who was not someone he had ever looked at before. To find out more about this person, Looney went to the Dictionary of National Biography, and he felt some elation as the article written by Sir Sidney Lee, quote, furnished more material in support of my constructive argument than any other single modern writer. In fact, just in that article alone, for all practical purposes, Looney found out that this person, basically an unknown person from the Elizabethan time, possessed just about all, if not all, of the characteristics of Looney's profile. He should have felt some elation. Now, at this point, I'm going to take just a moment to give a shout out to Jim Warren for his latest edition of Shakespeare Identified. In the earlier versions, Looney didn't do footnotes. And he mentions where he's going here and there for the books and the sources, but he doesn't give, sometimes he doesn't give the sources clearly enough, and he doesn't give page numbers. And that's what Jim, where are you? That's what Jim does and spent a lot of time doing. We've already exchanged emails about that, how much I appreciated it, especially even more as I'm putting together this talk to know that he talks about Halliwell Phillips, and he actually goes into the outlines that Halliwell Phillips, and he puts the and Jim tracked down footnotes and additions, and this is what really allows us to follow the pathways that Looney took in his search for Shakespeare. So we give you a thank you. I'm going to close this section of my talk by mentioning Dr. Alexander Grossart's collection of Oxford's poems, which actually were not initially what drew Looney to Oxford's poems, but he later found them because this was a collection published in Miscellanies of Fuller's Worthies Library, which you can now pull up on the internet. And I don't know if it's clear enough that you can see in this particular volume, volume 4, he's got poems of Lord Vaux, he's got, along with the Earl of Oxford, he's got poems of the father, Earl of Essex, son, Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, Sir Edward Dyer, and they're just volumes and volumes of these poems and early Elizabethan and Renaissance English works that Dr. Grossart published. So he's really quite an expert. And in his introduction to Oxford's poems, he has these two things to say. One is, and this is in Looney's book and gets repeated often, an unlifted shadow lies across his memory. And he's writing this, by the way, in 1872. So he's well before Looney. I mean, Oxford has heard of Oxford. This is a real obscure book of poems. An unlifted shadow, and of course that has an eerie sense, and we love that. But there's another comment in this introduction that Grossart made that I'm sure Looney read, but he doesn't mention it. I don't think he mentions this in his book. If this was meaningful to me, there is an atmosphere of graciousness and a culture about them that is grateful. And he's writing this about Oxford's, these poems that he has. When I was young, studying music in college, and I hate to tell you how many decades ago that was, there was something that I'd get told from time to time by a teacher. They would say, Bonner, you must realize that the preludes of Chopin are grateful. Bonner, you must realize that late Beethoven sonatas are grateful. And I figured what it meant, this word grateful, is that they were things that stayed with you, as, say, opposed to a Haydn sonata that you learn and you play, and then you never go back to it again. You've been there, done that. You know, it was good, but you don't need to ever relearn it. Something about these particular works that are artistically grateful, that they stay with you and that you go back to them again and again and they resonate and they just grow in meaningfulness. And I think that's what Dr. Grossart means with this. I offer that to you because it's an artistic setting, and that is an amazing comment for him to be making, and he has no hindsight bias. He doesn't know who Edward de Vere is. He doesn't know that 100 years from now, people are going to think Edward de Vere was Shakespeare. These are early works of Shakespeare. He just writes this amazingly insightful comment, and I just think it's so beautiful. So I offer that to you from the point of perspective of someone who studied piano many years ago. Now, we're going to turn to the test that, an important test of the hypothesis is, can it be validated by new information? And Looney knew about this. He wrote, "When a theory that we have formed from a consideration of certain facts leads us to suppose that certain other facts will exist, the later discovery that the facts are actually in accordance with our inferences becomes a much stronger confirmation of our theory than if we had known these additional facts at the outset." And doesn't Mr. Looney write well? It's just so elegant. Thank you. I'll close it down. Thank you, Bob. Okay. He wrote, "And so the parts of the mosaic keep fitting in." I'm going to talk to you as fast as I can about three things that Looney did not know about when Shakespeare Identified was published. First is Oxford's 1,000-pound annuity. Second is the specificity of Oxford's travels in Italy. And third are the personal connections between Oxford and the First Folio. So let's see if we can cover it pretty fast. This slide is here because this is the 1,000-pound annuity. And it's just nice to see it with your own eyes, that it really does exist. Here it is in Elizabeth's exchequer. This is something that I have been working on off and on for about 10 years. We know that Elizabeth ordered the money to be paid, but wasn't paid. Did this money actually go out of her exchequer? And this is one year that somebody sent me about 10 years ago, and I have more years, that yes, here are the 4 payments that Oxford was to be paid quarterly as per the instructions of the Privy Seal warrant. So I just wanted you to eyeball this. Now, Looney did not know about this 1,000-pound annuity. It was first introduced in 1923 by an American historian in a footnote in a short article that he wrote about Elizabeth's exchequer. It was really given to the world by none other than Bernard Ward in 1928 when it was published, and a transcription of it was published in his biography of Oxford. And Ward also noticed the remarkable non-accountability clause, which I'm not going to go into right now, but he knew it was unusual, and by golly, he was right. I discuss it in my book, and there's even more to be noted about that, but at a later time. Now, the annuity is a major anomaly, and I'm going to draw an analogy to Dr. House, for those of you who, like me, are fans of House, and his whiteboard. As you know, when an episode of House came along, there would usually be a patient walked in who had a very unusual set of symptoms. And the symptoms didn't make sense. But then House would put it on his whiteboard, and he'd have his residents and his associates try to figure it out. And they said, no, it's not this. No, it's not, can't be that, because they're very complex and contradicting. Well, this is what we have in our unifying explanation that he was searching for. This is what would be on his whiteboard if he were looking at the 1,000-pound annuity. The Queen is an avaricious skinflint. I don't think I should have to emphasize that. The Queen is dead broke, and very few people really understand it, which is why I wrote this follow-up article in the latest edition of the newsletter, how desperate she was for funds to support her war effort and to protect her country from the Spanish invasion. Yet, she's giving cold hard cash from her exchequer to a worthless, spendthrift, irresponsible, feckless nobleman who did nothing that we know of to earn it or deserve it. This is an anomaly of major proportions, and we're looking for the unifying explanation. Well, would the unifying explanation be had Queen Elizabeth lost her mind? No, that's not a good unifying explanation. No. I'm going to use Justice Stevens, because many people have said this, but he said it so well. And at the very bottom, the Queen may have decided to patronize a gifted dramatist who agreed to remain anonymous while he loyally rewrote much of the early history of Great Britain. And of course, we appreciate Justice Stevens for writing that and many other things. And not only that, but he was building in the English people their patriotism and their pride in their country that would make them want to fight for their country and fight the Spanish and keep their country from being overrun in a Spanish invasion, which was coming at the time this money started to roll out of her exchequer. Travel in Italy, real quickly. Of course, I've got 2 more shakes of a jiffy. Okay. Looney knew that Oxford had traveled in Italy, but what nobody really knew, and I didn't, and I've had other people say this to me until Mark had his phenomenal book published in 2005, Shakespeare by Another Name, and on the map on the left, he has the places that Shakespeare actually went in Italy, where he put together. We all knew Shakespeare was in Venice, and we knew, Oxford was in Venice, but what we didn't know, and Mark set it out so well, was exactly the specificity of where Oxford went when he was in Italy and the time frames. But at any rate, then then, 5 years later, Dick Rowe comes up with his fabulous book, Shakespeare's Guide to Italy. And when you put these two maps from these two books side by side, you've got a match. Where Oxford went in Italy just happens, maybe a coincidence, to be where Shakespeare set plays. Imagine that. One last thing. Looney, of course, knew from the Venus and Adonis dedication that Southampton was a very important person to the Shakespeare story. And he also knew that Southampton had been engaged, or the marriage proposal for this marriage with Oxford's oldest daughter had been on the table. I don't know that he knew how serious it was and for how long a time it was, but he knew about it. What he did not know that there were two other earls that are dedicatees of Shakespeare's works. The Earl of Pembroke and the Earl of Montgomery are the dedicatees of the first folio, and Looney did not know that. And thank you, Jim, for your index that I went through to check it out to make sure that this was new information. And of course, what we know is that Oxford had three daughters, and the middle pictures are the three daughters on Anne Cecil's tomb. And were it not for quirks of fate, all three daughters would have been married to all three dedicatees. The oldest daughter, Elizabeth, married to the Earl of Southampton. Middle daughter, Bridget, the middle daughter in the tomb, married to the Earl of Pembroke. And of course, the marriage did come together between Susan, the youngest daughter, and the Earl of Montgomery, who was the younger brother of Pembroke. So what we have here are three dedicatees and a trifecta on Oxford's side, a trifecta of personal connections. And so the parts of the mosaic keep fitting in. This unremarkable man solved this most intriguing of history's mysteries. And we are here today to give him the recognition that this phenomenal achievement deserves.